The financial system that funded America's dominance for 50 years is quietly dying. Not from enemies outside, from a structural collapse happening inside. And if you have a 401k, a bond portfolio, or retirement savings, what replaces it will either protect your wealth or erase it. Every financial commentator is pointing at the wrong thing. They show you BRICS nations rejecting the dollar, China buying oil in yuan, Saudi Arabia flirting with other currencies. And yes, those things are happening, but they are symptoms, not the cause. Here is the cause. And almost no one is saying this clearly enough. The petrodollar system was born from a single bargain struck in 1974. America had just abandoned the gold standard. The oil shock had rattled every industrial economy on Earth. And in that chaos, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia, one of the most consequential agreements in modern financial history. The Saudis would price all their oil exclusively in US dollars. They would take the profits, the billions flowing in from every barrel sold to every country on Earth, and park them in US Treasury bonds. In return, America would provide military protection, security guarantees, and political cover. The other Gulf producers followed. And what this created was a system of guaranteed, structural, non-negotiable global demand for American dollars. Every country that ran a factory, every country that flew a plane, every country that heated a home needed oil. And oil required dollars, and dollars needed somewhere to live. So they lived in US government debt. For 50 years, this arrangement let America borrow cheaply, run deficits that would have destroyed any other currency, print money at scales that would have caused hyperinflation elsewhere. Economists call it the exorbitant privilege, and it was exactly that. Now here is what broke it, and this is the part that will shock you. If you're finding this useful, subscribe, because what comes next is where most investors go completely wrong. The United States is now the world's largest oil and gas producer. It has surpassed Saudi Arabia. It has surpassed Russia. It is a net energy exporter. Read that again slowly, because it destroys the entire premise of the 1974 bargain. The agreement was built on America's need for Gulf oil stability. America needed the Saudis. America needed the Hormuz corridor open. America needed to garrison the Middle East because without Gulf oil, the American economy stalled. That strategic necessity is what gave the whole system its enforcement power. That necessity is gone. When the enforcement incentive disappears, the system it was holding together begins to loosen. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in headlines that scream, "Petrodollar is dead," but slowly, deliberately, structurally, like a building whose foundation is quietly shifting. You can see it in America's strategic repositioning right now. The calculated distance from Middle Eastern entanglements, the pivot toward the Western Hemisphere, the tolerance for instability in regions that used to be non-negotiable. This is not foreign policy confusion. This is a system in transition, behaving exactly the way systems in transition always behave. And the financial consequences land directly in your retirement account. Here is how. The petrodollar recycling mechanism, those billions of oil profits parked in US treasuries, was the single largest source of artificial demand for American government bonds for 5 decades. That demand kept treasury yields suppressed. Lower yields meant lower borrowing costs. Lower borrowing costs meant lower mortgage rates, lower car loan rates, lower corporate debt rates. The entire cost structure of American financial life for 50 years was built on top of that foundation. That foundation is cracking. Foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds are measurably reducing their treasury holdings. When structural demand shrinks, yields must rise to attract whoever is left. And when yields rise on a national debt approaching $40 trillion, the annual interest bill explodes. The Congressional Budget Office has already projected that interest payments on federal debt will surpass the entire U.S. defense budget before this decade ends. That is not a theory. That is arithmetic. Stay with me, because there's a curiosity loop I'm about to open that most investors never see coming, and it's 90 miles from American soil. Here is what this means if you are holding bonds right now. There are 2 kinds of yield increases: cyclical and structural. Most investors only know how to navigate the first kind. A cyclical increase is what happens when the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, then cuts them when the economy slows. You have seen this pattern dozens of times. You hold your bonds, you wait, the cycle turns, yields come back down, prices recover. That is navigable. A structural increase is different. It happens when the permanent buyer base for an asset permanently shrinks, when the petrodollar recycling mechanism, which was the marginal buyer of U.S. Treasuries for 50 years, is now contracting. You do not recover by waiting for a Fed rate cut. The buyer is gone. The yield adjusts, and it moves in one direction. Long-duration bonds are the most exposed. A bond portfolio that looked conservative and safe under the suppressed yield conditions of the last decade is a fundamentally different risk instrument in this environment. If you are in your 50s or 60s and your retirement account is heavy in fixed income, which most target date funds are, you are carrying more risk than your statements suggest. This is not alarmism. This is the mechanical consequence of a structural shift in who buys U.S. government debt. Now here is the part of this story that almost no financial commentator connects to the petrodollar transition. America is not just retreating from the Middle East, it is pivoting, strategically, deliberately, and with enormous capital implications, toward the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is step one, the pressure on the Maduro government, the opening of energy investment conversations, the recognition that Venezuelan heavy crude is precisely the grade that Gulf Coast refineries were designed to process. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Under normalized trade relations, that resource base replaces Middle Eastern dependence entirely and keeps the supply chain 2,000 miles from home instead of 12,000. But Venezuela is only the opening move, because 90 miles off the coast of Florida, there is an island sitting on top of deposits that China has been quietly trying to lock up for years. An island that holds some of the most strategically critical minerals on Earth. Minerals that power every electric vehicle, every AI data center, every advanced weapon system. And America has been legally blocked from touching it for over 60 years. Subscribe right now, because the next 2 minutes reveal why this island could be the most important geopolitical story of the next decade, and why patient investors who position early historically capture returns that late movers never see. Cuba. I know how that sounds. Stay with the economics. The modern global economy runs on a specific set of minerals that most people have never heard of. Cobalt, the material inside every rechargeable battery cathode. Nickel, essential for electric vehicle drivetrains and the stainless applications that industrial infrastructure runs on. Copper, the physical nervous system of every data center, every EV charging network, every renewable energy installation on Earth. Rare earth elements, the inputs for permanent magnets in wind turbines, electric motors, and weapons guidance systems. These are not commodities. These are strategic choke points. Cuba is the 5th largest cobalt producer on Earth. It holds some of the largest undeveloped nickel deposits in the entire Western Hemisphere. It has significant copper and rare earth resources, and virtually none of it is producing anywhere near capacity, for one simple reason. The country has been isolated from international capital markets and modern mining investment for over 60 years. Now consider who has been filling that vacuum. China controls approximately 60% of global rare earth processing. It has systematically locked up cobalt supply through investments across the Democratic Republic of Congo. It has moved aggressively into nickel in Indonesia and the Philippines. The critical mineral competition is the defining resource contest of this decade, not oil. The United States produces that in abundance now, but the physical inputs to the technologies that will determine economic and military leadership for the next 50 years. And China has been winning that competition for 2 decades while America watched. Now look at the sequence of recent moves with fresh eyes. The financial pressure on Venezuela, Cuba's primary energy supplier, which has forced Havana into a tighter economic corner. The isolation of Iran, another significant economic supporter of the Cuban government. These moves are systematically dismantling the external support structures that have allowed Cuba to remain independent of the international financial system. Whether you read these as deliberate strategy or convergent circumstance, their combined effect is the same. They are creating conditions for change. History offers a clear pattern here. Investment in Eastern European infrastructure began flowing before the Berlin Wall came down. Capital was positioning in Vietnamese manufacturing before diplomatic normalization was complete. The investors who captured the largest returns were not the ones who waited for certainty. They were the ones who understood the direction of structural forces and positioned into the uncertainty. Here is the hardest truth in all of this, and the one that frames everything else. Every major monetary transition in recorded financial history has produced a wealth transfer. Not because markets are rigged, not because some people are predators and others are prey, but because different assets hold their value differently across a transition, and the investors who understand which assets are which are positioned completely differently from those who do not. When Bretton Woods ended in 1971, when Nixon severed the dollar from gold convertibility, gold was priced at $35 an ounce. By 1980, it was over $800. Not because the world ended. Because the monetary anchor that had artificially suppressed its price for 25 years was suddenly removed. The investors who understood the mechanism, not just the headline, captured extraordinary returns. Everyone else adjusted afterward, at significant cost. The petrodollar system has served as a secondary monetary anchor. It created artificial global demand for dollars that kept hard asset prices lower than they would otherwise have been. As that anchor loosens, the same underlying dynamic applies. This is why the question is not whether you should pay attention to this transition, but whether you are positioned to benefit from it or absorb the cost of it. So what does this mean concretely for a portfolio? Dollar-denominated fixed income, treasury bonds, long-duration investment-grade debt, faces structural headwinds as its primary buyer-based contracts. These instruments are not going to zero, but their expected real returns over the next decade look materially worse than their historical average, and their risk profile is significantly higher than most retirement planning software currently models. The dollar itself will face sustained pressure, not a collapse. The dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency and will not be displaced suddenly. But a persistent, gradual devaluation against hard assets is the most probable path as the structural demand that the petrodollar system provided slowly fades. Hard assets benefit directly from this environment. Gold has functioned as a store of value across every monetary transition in history. Its role in the current transition is the same it played in 1971, repricing upward as the artificial anchors suppressing it loosen. Mining equities with exposure to cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earths sit at an early stage of what is likely a multi-year repricing cycle. The demand is not speculative. It is the physical requirement of AI infrastructure, electrification, and defense technology modernization. The supply response takes years to develop. That gap between demand certainty and supply constraint is historically where patient investors find their best returns. Western Hemisphere infrastructure, the companies building ports, processing facilities, and energy networks for a reshored American supply chain, represents a longer duration structural opportunity. These are not trades. These are positions in a generational reorientation of where American capital flows and where American economic relationships are anchored. I have studied monetary transitions for decades, and what I have learned is that the most consequential ones never announce themselves with a headline. They move slowly, then suddenly. We are in the slow phase right now. The petrodollar system that shaped the entire landscape of American financial life for 50 years is in structural transition. The direction is clear to those who look at the mechanism underneath the headlines. The timeline is measured in years, not weeks. But here is what history tells us with absolute consistency. The investors who adjust early, who move out of the assets most exposed to the transition and into the assets most likely to appreciate through it, do not look back on this period as a crisis they survived. They look back on it as an opportunity they recognized. The Bretton Woods investors who understood 1971 built generational wealth over the following decade. The petrodollar investors who understood 1974 captured 50 years of structural tailwinds. We are at a comparable inflection point, and the window of early positioning, before the obvious moment, before the consensus forms, before the transition is priced into everything, is open right now. That is the honest assessment of what I see. If this connected with the way you think about money and markets, subscribe. I do not post for volume. I post when something is worth understanding deeply. The next piece is already in progress, and it goes further into exactly which assets and geographies are most positioned for this transition, with specific frameworks you can apply to your own situation. The petrodollar era built extraordinary prosperity for those who understood it. Understanding how it ends, and what comes next, is how that pattern continues. Don't miss what's coming. Hit subscribe and drop a comment below. Do you think the Cuba opening happens in the next 5 years? Or is this a decade-long story? I read every response.